What up, though? Congressional Research Service, Federal Land Ownership Overview and Data, February 2020. The federal government owns roughly 640 million acres, about 28% of the 2.27 billion acres of land in the United States, properly America. Four major federal land management agencies administer 606.5 million acres of this land as of September 30th, 2018. They are the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Natural Park Service in the Department of the Interior, and the Forest Service in the Department of Agriculture. A fifth agency, the Department of Defense, excluding the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, administers 8.8 million acres in the United States as of September 30th, 2017, consisting of military bases, training, ranges, and more. Together, the five agencies manage about 615.3 million acres, or 27% of the U.S. land base. Many other agencies administer the remaining federal acreage. Now, you may ask yourself, how can anyone own soil? You can pretty it up and call it land, but in actuality, it's soil. It's what all of your sustenance comes from. So, how can men own soil? And why would they want to own soil that they themselves do not dwell on? We all come from the womb of a woman. This is what makes a slave. When you can't take care of yourself, when you're not self-sufficient, when you have to depend on someone else to live, or the quality of your life depends on the actions of someone else as opposed to your actions only. A summary of existing water rights laws. Who owns the water? August 2016, Water Systems Council. At the present time, states generally follow one of five common law rules for groundwater rights: the absolute dominion, aka the absolute ownership rule, or English rule. 11 states, the reasonable use rule, aka American rule, or rule of reasonableness. One is absolute ownership rule, or English rule. The reasonable use rule, aka American rule, or rule of reasonableness. The correlative rights doctrine, 5 states. The restatement second of tort rule, aka beneficial purpose doctrine, 2 states. And the prior appropriation doctrine, aka first in time, first in right seniority system, 13 states. Note that a separate state of rules applies to surface water rights. This report does not address surface water rights. States increasingly supplement or alter common law rules with state permitting statutes. At the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized some form of private property rights in water, but these rights are not absolute. Policymakers should be admonished to remember the limits of their authority to regulate the right to use water. States do not own the water. Water rights are determined primarily at the state level. Remember, it says states do not, quote, own, end quote, the water. Water rights are determined primarily at the state level. Originally, these rights were set out in common law or court cases. Common law continues to provide the basis for water rights in the United States, or properly America, the soil that's being occupied at the current moment by the United States, of which you participate in the occupation of your own soil, which brings us to having a conversation about owning water. Disgusting. The origins of groundwater law in the United States can be traced to the 19th century English and American courts, when most decisions were based on the law of property. To a much greater extent than other bodies of law such as torts, contracts, criminal law, etc., the development of groundwater law has been profoundly affected by scientific advances and our own understanding of hydrology. Whoever's writing this says, and our own understanding of hydrology. They say our. Doesn't include us. I didn't have a say so. I guess not saying anything was what I said. Several states claim, though, pronouncements in state laws or state constitutions that the state owns, quote, owns, end quote, the water. This claim does not reflect the law on this point. Does this mean that landowners or holders of water rights, quote, own, end quote, the water? Not exactly. Well, how many of you who, quote, own, end quote, a portion of land or a portion of soil, the soil of which you sprouted up from? How many of you claim to own a small portion, a small lot of land or soil? Well, what it says here is that it doesn't mean you own the water rights. It doesn't mean you own the water. I mean, this seems obvious. It seems like something that doesn't need to be spoken on. I mean, you didn't make the water. You didn't make the soil. So how would you own it? This talk of owning land and owning water, you have to understand, this means owning you. As the following section details, the law of each state defines who has the right to use groundwater. Who has the right to use groundwater? In prior appropriation states, the holder of the water rights owns this right. In other states, the right generally goes with ownership of land, but can be severed and conveyed separately. Just as with ownership of land, the state government and sometimes the local government can impose reasonable regulations on the use of water. Just as with ownership of land, the state government and sometimes the local government can impose reasonable regulations on the use of water. And how can they do that? Because they have a military. Because they have a military and they are willing to use it. Yeah, protesting won't work under these circumstances. Some states misinterpret the definition of waters of the state as meaning that the state owns the water. This extension of the law is also incorrect. The waters of the state terminology comes from waters of the United States in the Federal Clean Water Act, Section 404A of the Clean Water Act, 33 U.S.C. Section 1344, prohibits discharge of dredge or fill material into the navigational waters. 33 U.S.C. Section 1362 7 defines navigable waters as waters of the United States. The regulations under this provision further define waters of the United States, which include navigable waters, interstate waters, and certain wetlands. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states that government shall not take private property for public use without just compensation. Amendment 5, United States Constitution. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states that government shall not take private property for public use without just compensation. This depends on what the United States sees as just. And it means that they can take what they want. What they see as just compensation to you is life or death. Sometimes a regulation or law so restricts the use of property that the courts will rule that it is a regulatory taking or taking. Several recent cases address the takings issue with respect to water rights. This section discusses cases involving surface water as well as groundwater, since the principles are similar. Takings law. Imagine that. They have a law that's called takings law, the law of taking your shit. Provides that one may prove a taking in 3 different ways. You got to prove your shit was taken. If the governmental action involves a physical invasion or deprives the owner of all economically viable uses of the property, a taking has occurred. No shit. We call these 2 types of takings categorical takings because if you prove one of these 2 conditions, you need not conduct any further analysis. Most takings claims involve the 3rd test, a much more difficult test to meet. Under this test, called the Penn Central Balancing Test, the court balances the economic impact of the taking on the landowner, the landowner's reasonable investment-backed expectations, and the character of the governmental activity. This balancing test comes from the United States Supreme Court case of Penn Central Transportation Company, a New York City versus New York City, 438 U.S. 104, 1978. Any takings case is difficult for landowners or water rights holders to win, and takings litigation is extremely costly. Although some form of private property rights in water has been found to exist in all states, the Supreme Court has made clear these rights are not absolute. Rights, property, or otherwise, which are absolute against all the world, are certainly rare, and water rights are not among them. Property owners or holders of water rights come closest to owning water by owning the right to use water. Property owners or holders of water rights come closest to owning water by owning the right to use water. Just as the state or local government may regulate land use, federal, state, and local governments may reasonably regulate the right to use water. This is from a website called quotes.net. This is from the movie 300. The movie 300. This is a quote from the Persian messenger to King Leonidas of the Spartans. The Persian messenger says, "Listen carefully, Leonidas. Xerxes conquers and controls everything he lays eyes upon. He leads an army so massive it shakes the ground with its march, so vast it drinks the rivers dry. All the god King Xerxes requires is this: a simple offering of earth and water, a token of Sparta's submission to the will of Xerxes." Leonidas, King Leonidas of the Spartans. Earth and water. Leonidas draws his sword on the Persian messenger, whose back is to a large well. The Spartan guards follow suit and draw their swords on the other messengers. Do the right thing.